It was a little less than a year ago when my younger sister and I found ourselves in a situation that still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. We had just finished helping our grandmother with some household chores. She's in poor health and can't do much on her own, so we try to visit her as often as we can. She lives in a large rural condo complex, a sprawling maze of 6 or 7 buildings, each housing about 15 to 30 units. The parking lots are a labyrinth of driveways and intersections, with no designated parking spots. It's the kind of place where you have to drive around for a bit to find a decent spot, especially if you're trying to park close to a specific building. That day, I managed to park my car relatively close to my grandmother's unit. My sister and I were about to get in the car and head home when a gray SUV, a late 2000s or early 2010 model, pulled up and parked directly behind us. The passenger side door was just inches away from my bumper, effectively boxing us in. The driver, a slightly overweight, middle-aged blonde woman, stepped out of the car and briefly apologized, saying she was just unloading her groceries and would only be a minute. She seemed harmless enough. It was broad daylight. There were other people around, and she was clearly alone. We didn't think much of it and told her it was fine since we weren't in a hurry. I started the car, figuring she'd be quick. There was a set of concrete stairs adjacent to the parking lot that led to the nearest building, the one my grandmother's unit was in. I assumed the woman would take those stairs, but she didn't. Instead, after opening the hatch of her SUV and grabbing a bag in each hand, she slowly walked all the way across the parking lot to a completely different building. It was on the opposite side of the complex, far from where either of us were parked. I found it odd, but didn't say anything at first. My sister, however, noticed it too and mentioned that the woman might be making a delivery for one of the residents and not actually live there. It was a plausible explanation, but something about the woman's demeanor didn't sit right with me. She walked with purpose, heading straight for that distant building without so much as glancing at the other units. It was as if she knew exactly where she was going, even though the parking lot was far enough from most of the buildings that you couldn't see the numbers on the doors. To make matters even stranger, there were plenty of vacant parking spots much closer to her destination. In fact, the lot was about half empty at the time. I pointed this out to my sister, but she shrugged it off, telling me I was overthinking it. I wasn't ready to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman made several trips, back and forth, each time walking the same linear path across the parking lot. My annoyance grew as we sat there, waiting for her to finish. I'm not sure exactly how long we waited, but it was long enough for me to shut off my car again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman returned to her SUV for the last time. I started my car, ready to leave as soon as she moved. She pulled out, and I followed her through the parking lot and down a driveway that led to the main road. The complex is full of kids, so there are plenty of speed bumps and slow, watch for children signs. The woman came to a stop sign, turned right, and disappeared behind one of the buildings at the edge of the driveway. I followed her, turning right at the same stop sign, but when I did, her car was gone. Just gone. There were no other roadways she could have taken at that point. It was a straight part of the driveway that led to the main road, lined with speed bumps. Even if she had floored it as soon as she made the turn, I should have been able to see her taillights before she turned onto the main road. But there was nothing. No sign of her car, no sound of an engine, no trace of her whatsoever. I was stunned. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My sister, ever the calm one, tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just our minds playing tricks on us. But I knew what I had seen. Or rather, what I hadn't seen. The woman had vanished into thin air, and there was no logical explanation for it. To this day, I still bring it up with my sister, hoping she'll finally admit how strange it was. But she always has the same attitude, brushing it off as if it were nothing. Maybe she's in denial, or maybe she's just trying to keep me from spiraling. Either way, I know what I experienced, and it still haunts me. A few months after the incident with the vanishing SUV, my sister and I found ourselves back at our grandmother's condo complex. It was late evening, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. We had spent the day helping our grandmother with some errands, and by the time we were ready to leave, the complex was eerily quiet. The usual hustle and bustle of residents coming and going had died down, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool autumn breeze. As we walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced around, but the parking lot was empty except for a few scattered vehicles. My sister, sensing my unease, asked if I was okay. I brushed it off, attributing my discomfort to the lingering memory of the SUV incident. But deep down, I knew something was different this time. We got into the car, and I started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking spot, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the lot, partially obscured by the shadows. It was a tall, slender man, dressed in dark clothing. He was just standing there, motionless, staring in our direction. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his gaze piercing through the darkness. "Do you see that guy?" I asked my sister, pointing towards the figure. She squinted, trying to get a better look. "Yeah, I see him. What's he doing just standing there like that?" I didn't have an answer. The man's presence was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us for a reason. I decided to drive past him slowly, keeping an eye on him as we approached. As we got closer, I could see that his face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were dark and hollow. He didn't move or react as we drove by. He just continued to stare, his expression unreadable. Once we were past him, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him still standing there. But to my shock, he was gone. The spot where he had been standing was now empty, as if he had vanished into thin air. My heart raced, and I quickly looked around, but there was no sign of him anywhere. "Where did he go?" my sister asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "He was just there, and now he's gone." We drove in silence for a few minutes, both of us trying to process what had just happened. The encounter had left us on edge, and the rest of the drive home was filled with an uneasy tension. When we finally arrived at our house, we quickly went inside, locking the doors behind us. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the man's pale, expressionless face haunted my thoughts. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Who was he? Why was he standing there, watching us? And how had he disappeared so quickly? The next morning, I decided to do some digging. I called my grandmother and asked if she had seen or heard anything unusual lately. She hesitated before telling me that a few other residents had reported strange occurrences over the past few weeks. One woman claimed to have seen a shadowy figure lurking near her window late at night, while another man said he had heard whispering voices coming from the empty unit next to his. As I listened to my grandmother recount these stories, a chill ran down my spine. It seemed that we weren't the only ones who had experienced something inexplicable in the complex. But what did it all mean? Were these incidents connected? And more importantly, were we in danger? I decided to visit the complex again, this time during the day, to see if I could find any clues. My sister agreed to come with me, though she was clearly uneasy about returning. When we arrived, the complex seemed normal enough. Residents were going about their daily routines, and there was no sign of the mysterious man or any other strange occurrences. We spent a few hours walking around, talking to some of the residents, and asking if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Most of them brushed it off, saying that the complex was just a quiet place, with nothing out of the ordinary. But a few people admitted to having experienced things they couldn't explain: strange noises, fleeting shadows, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. As we were about to leave, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. Near the edge of the parking lot, where the man had been standing the night before, there was a small, dark patch on the ground. It looked like a stain, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a perfect circle of blackened grass, as if something had burned the ground beneath it. I knelt down to examine it more closely, but there was no smell of smoke or any other indication of what might have caused it. It was just there, a silent reminder of the strange events that had taken place. My sister and I exchanged uneasy glances, both of us knowing that this was no coincidence. We left the complex that day with more questions than answers. The encounter with the shadowy man and the mysterious blackened patch had left us both shaken. We didn't know what was happening in that place, but one thing was certain: something unnatural was at work, and it wasn't done with us yet. The events at my grandmother's condo complex had left me deeply unsettled. The vanishing SUV, the shadowy figure, and the strange blackened patch on the ground. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. My sister and I had tried to rationalize what we had experienced, but deep down, we both knew there was something far more sinister at play. Little did we know, the worst was yet to come. A few weeks after our last visit, my grandmother called me late one night. Her voice was trembling, and she sounded panicked. "You need to come over right now," she said. "Something's happening, and I don't know what to do." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my keys, called my sister, and we rushed to the complex. The drive felt like an eternity, my mind racing with possibilities. When we arrived, the complex was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and unnatural. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the parking lot, and the air was thick with an unshakable sense of dread. We found my grandmother in her unit, sitting on the couch with all the lights on. She looked pale and shaken, her hands clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "What's going on?" I asked, sitting down beside her. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I was in bed, about to fall asleep, when I heard a noise outside my window. It sounded like whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it got louder. I could hear voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I got up to look, and that's when I saw him." "Saw who?" my sister asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man, my grandmother replied, her eyes wide with fear. The same one you told me about. He was standing outside my window, just staring at me. But it wasn't just him. There were others too. Shadowy figures, all around the building. They were whispering, and it felt like they were waiting for something. My blood ran cold. I exchanged a glance with my sister, and I could see the same fear reflected in her eyes. We had hoped that the strange occurrences would stop, but it seemed they were only getting worse. We need to get you out of here, I said, standing up. You can stay with us tonight. My grandmother nodded, too shaken to argue. We helped her gather a few things, and as we were about to leave, I noticed something strange. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly, and a faint, icy mist was creeping in under the door. My sister noticed it too, and we both froze, our breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. What's happening? My grandmother whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the whispering started again. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and more intense, filling the room with an otherworldly cacophony. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come alive, twisting and shifting as if they had a life of their own. And then we saw them. The figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely human. They were tall and gaunt, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow and dark. They moved slowly, almost gliding, their whispers growing louder and more menacing. My sister and I instinctively stepped in front of our grandmother, shielding her from whatever was coming. Get back, I shouted, though I knew it was futile. These things weren't human, and they weren't going to listen. One of the figures reached out, its long, bony fingers inches from my face. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It was as if the very air around me had frozen, trapping me in place. My sister grabbed my arm, pulling me back, and the spell was broken. We need to go, she yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. We bolted for the door, half dragging my grandmother with us. The figures didn't follow, but their whispers echoed in our ears as we ran through the parking lot to my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. We piled in, and I started the engine, peeling out of the parking lot as fast as I could. The drive home was a blur. My grandmother sat in the back seat, clutching her bag and staring out the window, her face pale and drawn. My sister and I didn't speak, the weight of what we had just experienced hanging heavy in the air. When we finally arrived at my house, we helped my grandmother inside and made sure she was settled before collapsing on the couch, exhausted and terrified. That night, none of us slept. We stayed up, talking in hushed tones about what had happened and trying to make sense of it all. My grandmother insisted that we never go back to the complex, and I agreed. Whatever was happening there, it was beyond our understanding, and I had no intention of putting ourselves in danger again. In the days that followed, we learned that other residents had also experienced strange occurrences. Some had seen the shadowy figures, while others had heard the whispers. A few even claimed to have seen the same gray SUV that had vanished months earlier. The complex was quickly gaining a reputation as a place of paranormal activity, and many residents were moving out, unable to cope with the fear and uncertainty. As for my grandmother, she never returned to the complex. She stayed with us for a while before moving into a smaller, safer apartment. She never spoke about what happened that night, and neither did my sister and I. It was as if we had all silently agreed to bury the memories, to try and move on with our lives. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows stretch long across the walls, I can still hear the whispers. They're faint, almost imperceptible, but they're there, a chilling reminder of the horrors we faced and the mysteries that remain unsolved. And though I try to convince myself that it's just my imagination, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that complex, it's not done with us yet.